Okay, brothers and sisters, thank you for getting back promptly, and apologies, technology has delayed us a few minutes. Brother Nate asked me to advise that he's aware the back speakers aren't quite working yet. We're hoping we'll get them fixed over the morning tea break. That means that I will try and speak loudly. Luckily, it comes naturally to Brother Jack continuing his studies in Job around that broad theme of I know that my Redeemer liveth. And this morning, Brother Jack is to address us to the topic, Oh, that one would hear me.
Thanks, Brother Greg. I'm not sure, was I just called a loudmouth? In a nice way. Thank you. I do appreciate that. Well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to be back with you as we look at this wonderful story of Job. Now, yesterday I started, and I noticed we have started 5 minutes late, Brother Dorman, so I'm sure that'll be taken into account. We spoke a little bit yesterday about the wonderful events that are taking place, or wonderful perhaps is not the right word, but from a prophetic point of view and from our point of view, they are wonderful. And I talked about all those old charts that I'd been seeing for the last 50 years, and some of you, whilst not quite that long, are used to those charts with red arrows. And lo and behold, last night from one of the British papers, this is what I found. They've even used the right colour. And now we don't have to paint those charts because they are actually coming true. And whilst the suffering is not exciting, the step towards the kingdom of God is exciting. And we all should be excited about the wonderful things that our Father is showing us that tell us that he still rules in the kingdoms of men and giveth them to whomsoever he will. And one day soon he'll give them to his Son, and God willing, all of us will be there. But we left Job in a very different situation, not as far as hope is concerned, but as far as his physical well-being. He was in a terrible state. You'll recall that we were introduced to Job and we saw that he was a very, very faithful man. One of the greatest in all of the area that he lived. He was also a very wealthy man, very blessed by God. He had a wonderful family, 10 children, who as far as we know were very faithful. And I think in our last study, God willing, we'll be able to all but prove that they were faithful children who were following in the footsteps of their father. But such people, of course, can sometimes provoke envy and bad reactions in others. And as the ecclesia gathered together regularly in the presence of Yahweh, just like we do, I think we probably commented that they were called sons of God in chapter 1. And some people think, that means that this was a gathering in heaven. But of course it doesn't mean that at all. The angels are called sons of God in the book of Job in chapter 38. And the angels, as sons of God, were present rejoicing at creation. But in Genesis chapter 6, the term sons of God refers to the ecclesia in that place. And of course we know that in 1 John chapter 3, we are told, behold what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons and daughters of God. And so what we have in Job chapter 1 is a meeting of the ecclesia, just as this week, if this was recorded in the Bible, we could imagine that it would say hundreds of the sons and daughters of God gathered at Rathmines. And we hope that it would also say that Yahweh was in their midst, not as a person, but nonetheless, all of us have got in our lap the word of Yahweh. And so the Spirit, the word of Yahweh, is in our midst. And that's how it would be described, as it was then. But of course, one of those members was an adversary, an enemy of Job. And he challenged God's assessment of Job, and he said, Job is not righteous, Job is not faithful, he is just shrewd and cunning. He's a good businessman. He follows you because you pay him, basically. And God took that statement very seriously. And so he allowed the events to happen in Job's life, determined by the ideas of the adversary, but of course put into practice by God himself. And that would provide a testing ground, ultimately for Job, but primarily for those who had a wrong doctrine at that time, like the adversary. And we ought never to forget that the beginning of this story is the salvation of that adversary. God wanted him to turn around from his wrong view. And there were others, like Job's friends, who we find also had a wrong view. Even his wife started to think that way, and the wrong view, of course, was this view of exact retribution, which we talked about a little bit yesterday, and we'll talk about a bit more in a moment today. So we find Job in a terrible situation physically, emotionally. He's lost everything. And above all, he's lost his 10 children. And as we read Job, never lose sight of that. Here is a man that has lost all of his children. Perhaps the worst, probably readily give our lives for our children. But Job, not only himself was near death, but he had lost all of his children. So it's quite remarkable, some of the things that the friends say to him in light of the situation that he was in. But nonetheless, if we turn to Job chapter 2, and take up where we left off, they were good friends too, and they, in verse 12, they lifted up their eyes afar off, and they knew him not. They lifted up their voice and wept. They rent every one his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. They couldn't believe how terrible Job looked. As we said, and they reacted in a very sincere way. They identified with their poor friend. Threw dust with you if that happens. And they sat down with him, verse 13, upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no word. And the ministry of silence, as some express it, is a lovely ministry sometimes for those who are suffering. Just to have somebody there, to feel the comfort of someone who loves you and cares for you, the knowledge that somebody is there and caring in itself can be very helpful. In the end, of course, Job, after 7 days of silence, Job feels the need to speak. So I don't know, perhaps 7 days was a bit long, but nonetheless, finally, Job speaks, and his first speech is just a lament from him about how terrible he feels. He wishes he was dead. He curses his birth. He says in verse 3, "Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived." So I wish that I'd never been conceived, says Job. I wish that this had never even started. In verse 4, "Let that day be darkness. Let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it." Take it out of the calendar. Take my birthday out of the calendar. I wish, if I had to be conceived, then I wish I'd never been born, that day had never existed. Verse 11, "Why died I not from the womb? Why did I not give up the spirit when I came out of the belly? I wish that I had been stillborn." If I had to be conceived and I had to be born and have a birthday, then I wish that I had been stillborn. But of course he couldn't wish away his life. And in verse 21, he finally says, "Well, I just wish that I could die. I long for death, but it cometh not. And I dig for it more than hid treasures. Oh, that I could die." So here is a man in deep depression, understandably so, physically and emotionally, at his lowest ebb. And he just gives voice to how he feels. I wish that I was dead. Now, just a comment before we move on from this chapter, a very sad chapter, about verse 25. It says in the Authorised Version, "The thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me. I was not in safety, neither had I rest, neither was I quiet, yet trouble came." Now, some people latch onto those two verses and they say, aha, Job, this happened, that he had a problem. He was aware that he was riding for a fall, so there must have been some flaw in Job's worship, and of course Job wasn't a perfect man and never claimed to be. That was God's assessment of him, not perfect in being sinless, but a complete follower of him. But some people latch onto those verses and say, see, Job knew that there was trouble coming, so there must have been a problem in his life. And I don't believe that that is the case at all. In fact, another great knowledge of Hebrew, scholars tell us that the Hebrew adequately covers either of these views. The Revised has that in the present as dead. If you want to have a look at, of course, his friends finally began dozing off towards the end of the study, their heads jerked up, and they said, aha, what's he saying? What you reap. And that's what Eliphaz says in his first speech, and it's true. We will all sow what we reap. But of course we don't ignore the grace of God in what we might reap. None of us will sow enough to reap that wonderful reward that is offered to us. But nonetheless, that's said. Now, lest we think that we could never fall into this trap of the Lord Christ, of course the disciples, they had the Bible and they knew their Bible well, no doubt. But in John chapter 9 and verse 1 it says, as he passed by, he saw a man who was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Who did sin, this man or his parents, born blind? Exact retribution. Still alive and well in John 9. Still alive and well, suggest, in 2024 as well. The reply of Jesus, of course, is absolutely marvellous. Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. That was what was going to happen in the story of Job. And that might be what has happened or is going to happen in your life, but we have no way of knowing. And we learn that in Ecclesiastes. Come across Ecclesiastes just as we talk about this point for a little while, not too long because we don't. So Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Provides an explanation about this puzzle. If we sow what we don't sow what we reap, what does it mean? Well, this Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 11 gives us a good hint. Wise man, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. We might child not to touch. In fact, over the page in verse 1 of chapter 9, the wise man said, for all this considered in my heart, either love or hatred by all that is before them. All things are. So you can't really tell by observing my life whether I'm serving God faithfully or not. And I can't tell by looking at the things that happen to you necessarily, because ultimately God knows. And that is worked out in quite a remarkable way. That was the problem, friends. They had that problem. And we need to be wary of that problem because we very, very often judge by our eyes. And perhaps the most dangerous area of that judgment is about ourselves. If something happens to me and I say, I know why God is doing this to me, because I might think I've done that or the other thing, God, or I might just think I'm a faithless, worthless person. And this is why God is treating me that way. That's a terrible way to think. God doesn't want us to think that way. What he wants us to understand, and he will work this out as we go through Job, is that suffering does have a purpose. And it may well be that the suffering that you are going through is for the benefit of somebody else, as the suffering that Job was going through was primarily for the benefit of other people, though he himself was improved as a result of the things that we went through. I talked about Job at another ecclesia once many years ago, and there was one brother that I had some great conversation. He was a brother that had been through a lot of personal suffering. He'd been through a particular incident that was hold that thought in our minds, and when we get to the words of Yahweh himself later on in the book, I think we're going to see that that is true. Other times there may not be a specific reason for that suffering to come in a person's life, but there will be purpose. And we will see that when we hear Yahweh speak. Brother Roberts wrote, "Robbed of its power to destroy, if we realise a power to serve." So let's hold this in mind as we lead the doctrine of the doctrine of exact retribution. Now, Job has spoken his heartbreaking words of Job chapter 3, and now it's the time for the friends to speak. Now, what are these friends like? Introduce ourselves to them. Eliphaz is the older of the three. You can look up Job 15 and verse 10, that'll basically tell you that, but we won't do that right now. What sort of person was he? Well, the one that spoke first, so he had an aura of about him. He was the older man. He was perhaps himself as a wise, gentlemanly, sympathetic brother. But we will see as his words progress that perhaps he also had another side to him. Egotistical and superior. He was perhaps polite, but he was also brutal. Come to Job chapter 4. Bear in mind what Job is looking like and what he has been through, what he has just said. Verse 7, Elihu said this at the outset. "Remember, Job, I pray thee, whoever perished being innocent." What a way to start. Whoever perished being innocent. But for Elihu, he has one thing to lean on. He's had a vision in verse 12. "Now a thing was secretly brought to me, and mine ear received of." What he had a vision was the words of verse 17. "Shall mortal man be more just than God?" Listen to me. A vision. Shall mortal man be more just than God? And so sadly, as Eliphaz proceeds through his speeches, he goes from a polite, no doubt he's a caring friend and a good friend, but in the end, he makes up charges against Job that were totally untrue, but were necessary for him to be able to prove his theory that Job was suffering sin greatly. So it was a sad end, really, for Eliphaz. Bildad, over on the other hand, over in chapter 8, a slightly younger man, still a young man. Bildad, in verse 8 of chapter 8, said to Job, "Inquire, I pray thee, my age, and prepare thyself to the search of their fathers. For we are but of yesterday and know nothing, because our days upon earth are a shadow." In other words, Job, we have always believed in this. We have always done this. Isn't that sometimes a defence that's used in ecclesial life? Aha, we've always done this. Job, we've always believed this. And therefore away from it. And he talks about, perhaps just like your house is collapsed and all your children are gone. What lovely words they spoke. And about the gourd that grew up, but when the sun came out, while you went along and you had been those little word pictures, Job, and maybe they'll help you. So that was Bildad. And Zophar, well, he was a brutal. I said they're all adding a little bit for effect, but in chapter 11 and verse 6, this is Zophar said, "Know therefore that God exacted of thee less than thine iniquity deserveth." What a statement that was. What more did Zophar want? So there were the three friends. And there are some lessons to learn in that, aren't there, about the way that we deal with each other, and we'll talk about that more as we proceed. I sort of think as Eliphaz is the older, wiser, very unwise judge. He's like the judge to me. And I think of Bildad as the prosecutor, and I think of Zophar as the executioner. In fact, when I read these, I don't overdo this, but you try and make the characters real, so I try and give them voice. So I think of Eliphaz as he's the elder one. He would obviously be very much an English judge. Who ever perished? Job, really? Look at yourself. And when it comes to Bildad, apologies for the accent, Brother Jim, but I think of the American, the younger American guy. Now, Joel, we have always believed in this. Understand that. And I want you to consider these pictures. The papyrus, the spider's web, and the gourd. Think about those things, Joe. So that's how I think of Bildad. Apologies, Brother Jim. And when it comes to Zophar, and I don't want to offend anyone with this, but I'd say it was terrible accent, so I won't say what nationality it was, but that sort of helps them come alive a little bit to me. Had any idea doing, they just conclusion. They didn't know that God was actually very angry with them, and so was Elihu. A good reason. They needed a saviour, and in the mercy of God, he provided for them. Now, I do want to just read a little summary of the speeches of the three friends very quickly to help us to understand what was happening. So as we said, Eliphaz began politely enough, but he very quickly cut to the chase. Whoever perished being innocent. That becomes theme one, done to death in each subsequent speech. By the third round, Zophar, the final speaker, had nothing more to add. Zophar said nothing in the third round of speeches. One can imagine Zophar foregoing the final right of reply with an arrogant wave of his wrist. What's the point of talking to this man anymore? The theme sadly develops into outright accusations against Job of sins that he never ever committed. The noble Eliphaz concludes with a charge sheet that makes Job sound like a tyrant. Along the way, Zophar says that Job is actually suffering what he deserves, as we just saw. Remember what God's summary of Job's character was like. And think about that. If you are faced with difficulties with another brother or sister, and don't fall into the same trap. In addition to accusing Job directly, each friend in turn describes the terrible punishments that will come upon the wicked in this life for sins. As they became more frustrated, the list of dire consequences for sin grew longer and longer, but in the end, they ran out of things to say. They ran out of and adjectives. Scene 2 sounds very high-minded. Shall mortal man be more just than God? And this continues in various ways as is added to by each of them in turn. They talk about the greatness of God and the power of God, his superiority over man, the fact that his ways are beyond man, the fact that man is unclean in his sight. And Job doesn't disagree with any of those principles. He says things that agree with them, but in the end, they prove nothing, because in the end, God does have a plan with man, and God will provide a way for all of us to be through faith. But they don't talk about any of it. How can man be justified with God? How much less man that is a word the three friends spoke to Job was worm. And that's about where their arguments got them, sadly. And they were good friends. What happens next in the speeches, theme 3 in the speeches, is what does happen in such things. It gets personal and it gets nasty. They each accuse Job of speaking rubbish, of being full of hot air. They also express their personal at having been insulted. The final theme of their speech, gold carrot and stick this happens in ecclesial life, sadly, sometimes. But this is what they certainly did. If you will the Almighty, you shall be built up. Confess, and all will be well. Now that produced in Job another extreme. Job proclaimed his own righteousness loudly because he was wrong about he'd done this terrible sin. So he went to another extreme. We'll talk about that. But it was extreme that was necessary for God to bring to light and to show us some vital principles of the way of salvation. But without God's intervention, all they would have done that we have learnt from our Lord Jesus Christ, and not to make the mistakes that they made. Okay, so that's a little summary of the speeches of you. Reading through it, you pick up it's a very entertaining book to read. It's more serious than entertaining, but there's things like this all the way through. So Job says in chapter 16 and verse 9, God teareth me in his wrath. And Bildad pipes up in response, he teareth himself in his anger. And there's these little word games going on all the way through. God hath turned me over into the hands of the wicked, says Job. The light of the wicked shall be put out, says Bildad. The counsel of the wicked is far from me, says Job. I'm not wicked. Eliphaz responds by saying, well, the counsel of the wicked is far from me. So who is the counsel of the wicked far from? Job says, do you imagine to reprove words which are as wind? I know that I've spoken words that are as the wind, but look at me. I'm dying. I've lost everything. And Bildad's sympathetic response to that is, how long shall the words of thy mouth be like a strong wind? It was very nasty. Sure, they look back on it. That the wicked conceive mischief and bring forth vanity. Job said, mischievous comforters are ye all, the same word. Bildad said, he is cast into a net by his own feet. Job said, God hath compassed me with his net. Eliphaz says, has sent widows to hang a man or a woman for a word. And yet that's what they were doing to Job, and it's a very is when he appeals to his friends, and the other part is when he appeals to God. He actually leaves off appealing to his friends. The second theme that Job has is the one that they can never answer. Turn to chapter 9 and verse 1. Thing thereof I said it, he destroyeth the perfect and the wicked. If the scourge slay suddenly, he will laugh at the trial of the innocent. Job's language went to the extreme, and Elihu's going to point this out to him later on, as we'll see later on in the week. Job says the earth is given into God. Of course, his friends, remember, they're hammering him, saying, the earth is in the hand of the wicked, he said, when I observe all the things that go on around me. And God is covering up the faces of the judges, if those are the people that are supposed to be bringing out justice. And he says, if not, where and who is he? If it's not God that's allowing that to happen, then who is it? And they never are able to answer that, and we'll spend a little bit more time discussing that, but that's the sense. Like the friends, Job acknowledges the greatness of God. We all do. Job says, I would like to stand before God. He could speak first, or I would speak first. It wouldn't matter to me. And I would show that I am righteous and that I don't deserve what's happened. He's made a mistake. But then he says, I know, as all of us would say, I know that if I was in the presence of God, I'd be tongue-tied. I wouldn't be able to speak with him in the way that I'm saying. He said, I'd trip myself, condemning myself with my own tongue. It is somebody, and I believe that in Elihu, partly that request was, but through it, quite early with the friends to a great his observation of me, my friends scorn me, but mine eye poureth out tears unto God. And then he says a remarkable statement. Oh, that one might plead for a man pleadeth for his neighbour. Now the Revised Version has, oh, that he would maintain the right of a man with God and of a son of man with God. So what he essentially says is, I wish that God could plead with God on my behalf. Because there was this God that, as far as he could see, was making a terrible mistake. Harsh, cruel God that is causing me to suffer like this. And all my friends are telling me that I'm suffering like this because God is punishing me for something that I haven't done. God doesn't exist. So rich with so many things, sad in so many ways. I hope that as we look at some of these verses, or as you read through Job, or probably have read through Job, that you will think, yes, I know what it's like to think like that. I have been very low. Some of you have. Some suffer more than others. It's an insight of the words of Job, and just get a feel for what this man's going through. Chapter the man is wonderful. Just pardon them. What am I doing to you? But who can deliver me out of your hand? And look, skin and flesh, you fence me with bones. Thou hast hid. I know that this is with me. Moffat says, all the while, this was the... But it doesn't mean that God has deserted us. God was so close to Job that he had no idea he was going to find out. God's going to tell him. But those are the feelings that he had all the while. You did all this for me. His friends were wrong, and in that he was right. Over in chapter 19 and verse 7. I felt like this. Behold, I cry out of wrong, but I'm not heard. I cry aloud, but there is no judgment. He hath fenced up my way that I cannot pass, and he hath set darkness in my paths. And this chapter eventually drives him to those sad words in verse 21 to his friend. Well, verse 19, all my inward friends abhorred me. They whom I loved have turned against me. My bone cleaveth to my skin and to my flesh, and I am escaped with the skin of my teeth. Have pity upon me. Have pity upon me, O ye my friends. Let us never, ever turn our back on somebody who makes a plea like that, or answer them in the way that Zophar does, with a sarcastic, nasty response. This was a man that was going through the depths of depression, but who never lost his faith that in the end right would prevail. Over in chapter 21 and verse 7, and this is a summary of the argument that, of course, Job's friends could never answer. Wherefore do the wicked live, become old, yea, are mighty in power? David raises that point in the Psalms. Jeremiah raised that point also. Faithful men and women have always struggled with that point, and perhaps we do sometimes too. We look out there and we think they are all having a wonderful life, and I've got all these problems. How can that be right? How can that be righteous? Well, two things. God sees the end from the beginning, and they are not having a wonderful life. It just looks good from a distance. But Job, there was no answer to that. Wherefore do the wicked live, become old, yea, are mighty in power? He even presents a picture of a very wealthy and wicked man who is overweight. His eyes are bulging out on his cheeks, and eventually he dies. And he said, when he dies, everyone queues up to say how wonderful he was. And even when he's buried, the grass grows sweetly on top of his grave, and he never suffers a moment in his life. How can that be right? Says Job. So we're nearly running out of time, but I noticed Brother Brian is giving me the extra 5 minutes, and I appreciate that very much. And I think it's worth it just to go through these words of Job. Have you ever felt like this in chapter 23? Chapter 23, verse 8. If you do feel like that, then talk to your brothers and sisters and friends. And remember the experience of Job. He said in verse 8, "Behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand where he doth work, but I cannot behold him. He hideth himself on the right hand, that I cannot see him." I can't find God in all of this, said Job. And I don't blame him at that point, given the treatment at the hand of his friends. But in verse 10, "He knows the way that I take, and when he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot hath held his steps, his way have I kept and not declined." He couldn't find God, but he knew that God was there somewhere. And of course, ultimately, he found out the answer to all of his questions. Over in chapter 26 and verse 1, this is a little bit of sarcasm from Job. After the final word of his friends at the end of chapter 25, the last word was worm, Job says, understandably in verse 2 of chapter 26, "Oh, how you have helped him that is without power," which is Job himself. "How you've helped me. How you've saved the arm of the one that hath no strength. How you've counselled him that hath no wisdom. And how you've plentifully declared the thing as it is. You've all done a wonderful job." At one point he says, "I wish you would all just be quiet, like you were for the first 7 days. Let that be your help to me. Just be wicked." Come over to chapter 30 and verse 18, and we're drawing to a close now, I assure you. Or chapter 29. Chapter 29 is a lovely chapter. It talks about Job's former life and how much the truth was at the centre of his life. And in verse 14, he perhaps overstates it a bit, of chapter 29. He says, "I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My judgment was as a robe and a diadem." And we've put on Christ, and we're very thankful for that. And we're very happy to state that to anyone who wants to listen. And Job was saying the same thing. "I put on righteousness, and it clothed me." But over in chapter 30 and verse 18, he says, "By the great force of my disease is my garment changed. I no longer feel like I'm wearing righteousness. It binds me about as the collar of my coat." Isn't that sad? 31, where the word... Are you about to ring the bell? I just want to finish with this. Job lived some of the things that later became part of the teachings of our Lord. Job said, "I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon his mate?" As he expressed the life that he lived, saying, "I don't deserve this, my friends. This is what I did." Jesus said the same, didn't he? "Whoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery in his heart." Job understood that. He said, "If I rejoiced at the destruction of him that hated me, or lifted up myself when evil found him," Job never did that. He didn't laugh in the face of the adversity of his friends. When someone succeeded, a little bit of him didn't die, because he wasn't that sort of person. And Jesus said, "Whoever is angry with his brother without a cause is in danger of the judgment." He said, "If I covered my transgressions as Adam, I never did." And Jesus also likewise decried hypocrisy. And so we'll leave it there, because thank you very much for the extra time there, Brian. We'll leave Job there, and we'll come back to the words of Elihu, God willing, tomorrow.
Brothers and sisters and young people and friends, I'm sure you join with me in thanking our brother Jack for his words this morning and reminding us of many of the wonderful lessons that come from the life of Job, a consideration of the life of Job. I was particularly touched by the firm conviction of Job that God was righteous despite all the suffering he was going through, and also those thoughts around need we